It all started when I saw an ad online for a pet sitting job. It seemed easy enough: feed the pets, water the plants, and stay at the house overnight while the owners were on vacation. Plus, the house was out in the countryside, quiet and peaceful. I thought it would be a relaxing break from my usual life. I was so wrong. When I first arrived, it was late in the afternoon. The house was huge, an old Victorian mansion with ivy climbing up the walls and large, dark windows that seemed to stare back at me. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Avery, were already packed and ready to leave. They were polite but in a rush, giving me a quick tour before they left. I followed them around as they showed me where the food was kept, how to lock up, and the rooms I could use. Finally, they introduced me to the pets. There were two: a large black cat named Salem and an old, tired-looking dog named Max. Salem had sharp yellow eyes and an unnerving stare, while Max seemed gentle, barely moving from his bed. Mrs. Avery gave me a little smile as they left and said, "Make sure you keep Salem out of the basement. He has a habit of getting in there." They didn't explain further, and before I could ask, they were gone. The first evening was quiet. I fed Salem and Max, locked up, and settled in the cozy living room with a book. But as the night fell and the house grew dark, I started hearing strange noises: scratching, faint footsteps, even a low whisper that seemed to come from the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an old house creaking. Then I noticed Salem. He was sitting at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness with his piercing yellow eyes. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just a cat being a cat. Eventually, I went upstairs to my room, locked the door, and fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night to a strange noise, a soft thumping coming from downstairs. My heart raced, but I forced myself to get up and check it out. As I went down the creaky stairs, I found Max lying in the hallway, staring at something. He looked terrified, his old eyes wide, staring into the shadows near the basement door. I was about to turn away when I heard a sound from the basement. It was a faint scratching noise, like someone or something was trying to claw its way up the stairs. I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering what Mrs. Avery had said. I called Salem, hoping he would come and distract me from my fear. But Salem didn't come. I couldn't see him anywhere. I took a step toward the basement door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The scratching grew louder, and I could have sworn I heard a low growl. Just then, Salem appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, hissing and arching his back, his yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. It was like he was warning me to stay away. The next morning, I tried to brush off the experience. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar house. But every night it got worse. The noises grew louder, and every time I looked around, Salem was there, staring at the basement door as if he was guarding it. Max grew more anxious too, whining and pacing, his eyes always fixed on that door. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to put an end to the mystery. I grabbed a flashlight and, despite my fear, opened the basement door. The stairs were steep and narrow, leading down into complete darkness. The air was thick with a damp, musty smell, and I could hear faint noises coming from below: scratches, whispers, and a soft, low growling sound that made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, gripping the flashlight tightly. Halfway down, I heard a sudden loud thump behind me, and the basement door slammed shut. My heart pounded as I spun around, only to see Salem sitting at the top of the stairs, staring down at me with those unblinking yellow eyes. Suddenly, I felt something cold brush against my arm. I turned the flashlight, and in the dim light, I saw a figure at the bottom of the stairs. It was a shadowy shape, tall and thin, with long fingers that seemed to reach out for me. I froze, unable to move, my eyes locked on that dark figure. It moved closer, and I could feel the temperature drop. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow reached out, its fingers almost touching me, when suddenly there was a loud hiss. Salem leapt down the stairs, hissing and swatting at the figure. The shadow recoiled, shrinking back into the darkness as Salem stood between me and it, his fur bristling, his eyes blazing. The basement grew silent again, and the figure melted into the darkness. Trembling, I stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. Salem sat there calmly, as if nothing had happened, licking his paw. Max was lying in the corner, his eyes wide and fearful, but he wagged his tail slightly when he saw me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed in the living room, keeping all the lights on and clutching my flashlight. When morning finally came, I packed up my things and left without looking back. I left a note for the Averys, saying I couldn't stay, that something in their house wasn't right. I never saw Salem or Max again, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I think about that basement and the shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. And I wonder if Salem is still there, guarding the house from whatever lies beneath. Even after I left, I couldn't shake the memories of that night. Every time I tried to sleep, I would see that dark shape reaching out to me from the bottom of the basement stairs, the whispering sounds, and Salem's yellow eyes piercing through the shadows. A week later, I got a message from Mrs. Avery. She wanted to know if I'd found anything unusual during my stay. My first thought was to ignore her, to leave that creepy experience in the past, but curiosity got the better of me. So I called her back. Mrs. Avery sounded relieved. "Oh, thank goodness you're okay," she said. "We weren't sure if you'd even stayed the whole time. We came home, and the house was different." And Salem, she trailed off. I could hear the tension in her voice. "What happened?" I asked, feeling a chill creeping up my spine again. "It's hard to explain, but ever since we bought this house, we've had strange issues, mostly in the basement. We thought it might just be the house settling or old pipes, but it's more than that. Strange things keep happening. Objects move, we hear voices, and sometimes we see things." My heart pounded. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't want to scare you away," she said, almost pleading. "But since you left, it's only gotten worse. Every night we hear scratching sounds, and Salem won't leave the basement door. Last night he scratched at it so hard he hurt himself. Max hasn't been the same either. He's so anxious now." I wanted to hang up and leave the conversation in the past, but something inside me needed to know the truth. "Have you ever seen a shadow down there?" There was a pause. "Yes," she whispered, "we've both seen it. It's not just a shadow, though. It follows us, and it seems to get stronger the longer we stay. It's why we took so many trips this year. We can't sleep in that house for more than a few nights without it showing up." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to tell her to leave, to get out of that house and never go back, but she continued. "We've been looking into the history of the place. The original owners built it in the 1800s. They were a strange family, very private. There were rumors of dark things happening here. Some say the original owner dabbled in dark magic, that he tried to summon spirits or demons. Others say he went mad and kept something, or someone, trapped in the basement. We always thought they were just old ghost stories." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We were hoping. Well, Salem seemed to like you, and for some reason he feels safer around strangers. We thought maybe, if you came back, you could help, maybe just for one more night." Every part of me wanted to say no, but something about her voice, the desperation in it, made me feel like I couldn't refuse. So 2 days later, I found myself back at the house, standing in front of the looming mansion as dusk settled in. Mrs. Avery opened the door, looking exhausted and more frightened than I'd ever seen her. She didn't say much, just showed me to the living room and handed me a small, heavy iron key. "This is for the basement," she whispered. "We don't go down there, not anymore." That night, as I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, I heard the noises start again. The scratching, the faint whispers, the sound of something heavy moving down below. Max lay by my feet, trembling, his eyes fixed on the basement door. Salem was nowhere in sight. Finally, after what felt like hours, Salem appeared in the hallway. He walked slowly, his back arched, eyes narrowed, and went to the basement door, pawing at it and letting out a low, throaty growl. I knew he wanted me to follow. With trembling hands, I took the iron key Mrs. Avery had given me and approached the basement door. Salem watched me, his eyes gleaming in the dark, as if warning me of the danger ahead. I unlocked the door, and as it creaked open, an icy gust of air hit me, carrying with it that familiar, damp smell. I stepped down into the basement, one step at a time, with Salem right beside me. The flashlight beam shook as I held it, the shadows dancing on the stone walls. At the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The shadows weren't just shadows, they were shapes, figures moving slowly along the walls. And then I saw it, the tall, dark figure standing in the center of the room. It was clearer this time, more solid, like it was gaining strength. Its face was still hidden in shadow, but I could see long, thin arms and claw, like fingers. The whispers grew louder, forming strange words that sent chills through my body. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move, as if something was holding me in place. Salem suddenly let out a loud, fierce hiss and leapt at the figure, swiping at it with his claws. The figure recoiled, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. I felt the grip on me loosen, and I managed to take a step back. But the figure wasn't gone. It lunged toward me, reaching out with those long, bony fingers. I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. The flashlight flew from my hand, rolling across the stone floor and casting wild, spinning beams of light. Just as the figure was about to reach me, a bright flash erupted from Salem, a strange, glowing aura surrounding him. He let out a fierce yowl, and the dark figure shrieked, a sound so horrible it echoed through the entire basement, rattling my bones. The shadow seemed to waver, and then slowly it began to dissolve, pulled back into the darkness, as if by some invisible force. When it was gone, silence filled the basement. I lay there, gasping for breath, unable to move. Salem walked over to me, his yellow eyes calm and bright, as if to say it's over. I scrambled back up the stairs, barely daring to look back. As I reached the top, I heard the basement door click shut behind me, locking on its own. I didn't need to ask Mrs. Avery what had just happened. Whatever dark presence had been in that basement was finally gone, thanks to Salem. I left that house that morning, vowing never to return. I don't know what Salem really was, maybe just a cat, maybe a guardian, or something much older and more powerful than I could understand. But one thing I do know, some houses hold secrets that should never be disturbed. It was supposed to be a simple job, 2 days of pets sitting in a quiet little house on the edge of town. The place belonged to a woman named Mrs. Jensen, who seemed perfectly ordinary at first. She had one small dog, a fluffy Pomeranian named Ginger, and an older cat, a tabby with a torn ear named Oscar. The house itself was old and creaky but charming, with floral wallpaper and antique furniture. But the real kicker was in her request just as she was about to leave. She turned to me with a strange, almost apologetic smile. "The attic is off limits, dear," she said softly. "Just stay out of there and everything should be fine." My curiosity instantly flared up. "Is something wrong with the attic?" I asked. She hesitated. "There are just things up there that shouldn't be disturbed, and it's best if Ginger and Oscar don't go near it either." With that, she left, and I was alone with the animals and my imagination running wild. I kept telling myself it was nothing, probably just dusty old furniture or broken things she didn't want me to see. But still, I felt the weight of her warning. The first day went by peacefully. Ginger was playful and sweet, following me around the house, while Oscar mostly kept to himself, lounging in sunlit spots and watching me with those unblinking, amber eyes. By evening, I had almost forgotten about Mrs. Jensen's strange warning. But as night fell, things changed. Ginger started barking at nothing, her little body trembling, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. Oscar, who had been calm all day, began pacing the hallway, his tail flicking and his ears flat against his head. I followed their gazes, up to the ceiling, directly where I knew the attic door would be. A soft sound broke the silence, a tiny, almost inaudible thump. It was coming from above. I froze, listening. There it was again, a faint thumping, like footsteps, light and quick, moving across the attic floor. My stomach twisted with fear, but I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. Then, something else, a soft, delicate giggle. I grabbed my phone, the only source of light nearby, and made my way up the stairs, the animals following close behind. Each step creaked under my feet, and the sound in the attic grew louder. The giggling had stopped, but now I heard something else: whispers, faint and almost childlike. At the top of the stairs, I saw the pull cord for the attic door, hanging there like an invitation. I reached up, barely aware of what I was doing, and pulled the cord. The door opened with a creak, and a ladder unfolded down toward me, leading up into the dark. Against every instinct I had, I climbed up into the attic, holding my phone's flashlight out in front of me. The attic was dimly lit by a single bare bulb, casting long shadows across the walls. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by my presence, and then I saw them, the dolls. There were dozens, maybe even hundreds, lined up on shelves that ran along every wall of the attic. Porcelain dolls, rag dolls, old-fashioned and new, all in perfect, eerie rows, their glassy eyes staring at me from every corner. Some were tiny, barely the size of my hand, while others were as big as a toddler, with delicate dresses and painted smiles. As I took a step closer, I felt a chill, as if the air in the room had dropped several degrees. I shone my flashlight across the rows of dolls, and that's when I saw something that made my skin crawl. One of the dolls, a large one with curly brown hair and a painted face, had turned its head slightly, its eyes no longer staring straight ahead, but looking directly at me. I felt my breath catch, and I took a step back. Suddenly there was a soft, scraping sound, like tiny feet shuffling across the floor. I looked down and saw another doll, a small one in a red dress, lying face down on the floor. I could have sworn it hadn't been there a moment ago. I backed up, desperate to get out of the attic, but as I turned toward the ladder, something stopped me. I heard the giggling again, louder this time, echoing around the attic. The dolls seemed to be watching me, their eyes following my every move. I grabbed the ladder and started to climb down, but as I looked back over my shoulder, I saw a group of dolls was now clustered together, standing upright, their heads tilted toward me, like they were silently whispering to each other. And in the middle was the doll with curly brown hair, still looking straight at me, a strange, twisted smile on her face. I practically flew down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and I could still hear the faint giggling coming from above. I locked the attic door, hoping it would be enough to keep whatever was up there from coming down. That night, the sounds didn't stop. Every few minutes I'd hear a soft tapping on the ceiling, like tiny hands knocking from above. At one point, the whispers grew louder, and I thought I heard a faint, childlike voice saying, "Come play with us." Ginger and Oscar stayed close to me, neither of them sleeping, both staring up at the ceiling with wide, fearful eyes. The next morning, Mrs. Jensen returned. I was ready to tell her everything, to demand an explanation, but the moment she walked in, she took one look at my face and nodded. "I see you've met the dolls," she said quietly. "They were my grandmother's. She was a collector. She always said the dolls were her children and treated them like they were alive. When she passed, they were all left to me. I tried to keep them locked away, but they don't like to be alone for too long. They get restless." I stared at her, my skin crawling. Restless. She nodded, her face pale. "They sometimes move around, whisper, play tricks. They like to test people, especially strangers. That's why I told you to stay away from the attic." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but at the same time, I had experienced it all myself. I quickly gathered my things, my mind racing, desperate to get out of that house. As I turned to leave, Mrs. Jensen placed a hand on my arm. "Thank you for watching, Ginger and Oscar," she said softly. "And I'm sorry about the dolls. They get lonely up there." I left without looking back. But even now, I can't get the memory out of my head, the image of those dolls, lined up in perfect rows, their cold, glassy eyes staring, waiting. And sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear that soft, childlike giggle echoing in the back of my mind. I was desperate for money, and when I saw a flyer in town advertising a pet-sitting job in a nearby village, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The pay was good, and all I had to do was take care of a few cats for an elderly woman named Mrs. Willow while she visited her family. She seemed kind, a bit frail but cheerful when I met her, and her home was this charming, old-fashioned mansion tucked away at the end of a quiet road. As soon as I walked inside, I noticed the portraits. They were everywhere, lining the walls of the hallways, the stairs, and even in the bedrooms. The paintings were of old-fashioned figures, mostly dressed in Victorian clothing, their eyes following you as you walked through the house. Some looked like relatives, others like strangers, and all wore serious, unsmiling expressions. Mrs. Willow told me she kept them up as a tribute to her ancestors, as they had lived in the house for generations. "They're family," she said softly. "They watch over this place before leaving." She pointed to a specific door at the far end of the hallway. "One thing, dear, don't go into that room. It's not safe. None of the cats go in there either. Just stay clear." I nodded, a bit puzzled, but agreed. How hard could it be? That first night, everything seemed normal. The three cats, Mittens, Whiskers, and Pip, were easygoing. They followed me around, curling up on the furniture as I moved from room to room. The house was a bit drafty, and every now and then I'd catch the strange smell of something old, like musty wood or dried flowers. As I sat down in the cozy living room with a book, a chill ran down my spine. It felt like someone was watching me. I glanced up and saw that the walls in this room were also lined with portraits. One painting in particular caught my eye. It was of a young girl in a long black dress, her face pale with dark circles around her eyes and an expression that was almost sad. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the strange, eerie charm of the house. Around midnight, the cats started acting strangely. Pip began hissing, his back arched as he stared at the hallway leading toward the forbidden room. Mittens and Whiskers followed suit, their fur standing on end. I tried to calm them, but they kept their eyes fixed on that dark corridor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I knew Mrs. Willow had said not to go near that room, but the noises grew louder, soft footsteps, almost like the swish of fabric against the floor, and faint whispers that seemed to echo down the hall. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept down the hallway, the cats following close behind, their eyes wide and watchful. As I approached the door, the smell of something rotten hit me, making my stomach churn. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob, and suddenly, the whispering stopped. The entire house fell silent. I felt something brush past me, cold and unsettling, like a draft, but there was no wind. I turned to leave, but the door opened on its own, creaking slowly as if inviting me in. Inside, it was dark, and I couldn't see much, but there was a single small window with a faint moonlight casting an eerie glow over the room. My flashlight flickered, barely illuminating the shapes inside. Dusty furniture covered in white sheets lined the walls, and in the center of the room was an empty chair, positioned right in front of another portrait. The portrait was of a man, stern and intimidating, his eyes dark and angry. His expression was severe, almost menacing, and I had the disturbing sense that he was glaring directly at me. I took a step back, suddenly regretting my decision to come into this room, when I heard a low voice whispering from the corner. "Why are you here?" I spun around, but no one was there. The whisper grew louder, echoing around the room. The cats had all run off, leaving me alone with this unsettling voice. I fumbled for the door, but as I tried to leave, the door wouldn't budge, it was stuck. Panicked, I turned back toward the portrait, and that's when I saw it. The figure in the painting had moved. The man was no longer looking at me. His head had turned, his face now angled toward the door, his hand raised as if pointing me out. I froze, feeling trapped under his gaze, when I heard the whisper again, louder this time, "You shouldn't have come in here." Suddenly, a heavy weight pressed down on my shoulders, as if invisible hands were holding me in place. I struggled to move, to call out, but my voice was gone. The weight grew heavier, pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. I felt something cold wrap around my arms, pulling me backward toward the portrait. And then, out of nowhere, Pip appeared, hissing and scratching at the air in front of me, his green eyes wide with fear. It was as if he could see something I couldn't, something standing between me and the portrait. The pressure lifted, and I stumbled forward, breaking free from whatever had been holding me. The door suddenly creaked open, and I didn't wait to understand what was happening. I grabbed Pip and bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The whispering stopped, and the air in the hallway felt lighter, as though a heavy presence had been locked away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, the cats huddled close to me, their eyes still fixed on the hallway. I waited for morning, my heart racing at every small sound, every creak of the floorboards. When Mrs. Willow returned, I couldn't hold back. I told her everything. She listened quietly, her expression somber, and nodded. "I should have warned you more," she said softly. "That room belongs to my great-grandfather. He was a cruel man. They say his spirit still haunts the house, watching over his belongings, and he doesn't take kindly to intruders." I told her about the portrait, how it seemed to move, how it had nearly. I couldn't finish the sentence. "Those paintings," she whispered, "are not just portraits. They're windows, places where spirits can linger. My great-grandfather was one of the worst. He left a dark mark on this house, and sometimes he finds his way out." I left that day swearing never to return to that house, but I couldn't forget the feeling of those cold, invisible hands, or the sight of that angry face turning toward me in the painting. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see him, watching, waiting, daring me to open that door once more.